I'm Cary Coglianese, and I am the director of the Penn Program on Regulation, and I am delighted to welcome you to today's webinar and panel discussion on building better government, priorities and challenges for the new administration. This will be an interactive session, and you will have an opportunity to pose questions to the panel members. To do that, use the Q&A function on Zoom down in the bottom menu in your Zoom screen. You can pose your questions there, and I will select from those questions to ask of the panel members a little bit into our session today. I want to thank Anna Gavin and Andrew Coopersmith for all of their work in putting together today's panel, and I'd like to thank you for joining us. To get us started, I'm going to introduce all three of our panel members, and then we will begin our conversation. Our first panel member, Phillip Howard, is senior counsel at the law firm of Covington and Burling, and he's one of America's leading authorities on simplifying government and streamlining regulations. You may have heard of his influential bestseller, The Death of Common Sense, from the 1990s, which President Bill Clinton famously would hold up as an exhibit for ways of fixing government. And he's been the author of numerous books since. He is also the founder of Common Good, a nonpartisan national coalition dedicated to good government principles and to replacing red tape with individual accountability. Our next panel member, Elaine Kmark, is a senior fellow in the Governance Studies program and director of the Center for Effective Public Management at the Brookings institutions. She is an expert on electoral politics and on government innovation and reform. She served in the White House from 1993 to 1997, where she created and managed the Clinton administration's National Performance Review, known as the Reinventing Government Initiative. She's the author of numerous books and also a lecturer in public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. And finally, our third panel member, Peter Schuck, is the Simeon Baldwin Professor of Law Emeritus at Yale Law School, where he served as the Deputy Dean, and currently is a scholar in residence at NYU Law School. He's taught and written widely in the areas of torts, immigration, administrative law. Among his many books are perhaps the most relevant today might be Why Government Fails So Often and How It Can Do Better from 2014. Before becoming a professor, he served as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy Planning at the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare in Washington. Phillip and Peter have recently co-authored an op-ed in USA Today on how the Biden administration can reform government. Elaine has a fascinating new Brookings paper on agile government and responses to mega change. And I thought I would start by asking each of you to reflect on the mega change that we are all living through, the COVID pandemic, and what insights the governmental response to it can provide about the need for governmental reform more generally. Phillip, maybe we can start with you. In your op-ed with Peter, you refer to the delays that the Food and Drug Administration experienced in approving tests for COVID back about a year ago. What lessons can we draw from COVID and the government's handling of it about the need for better government overall?
Well, thanks, Cary. I just want to say I'm delighted to be on this panel. My mother would be very proud that I'm on the same panel with Elaine Kmark and Peter Schuck and Cary Coglianese. So there you are, an apex. Well, Americans are frustrated with government, and the surveys show that it's pretty evenly distributed by parties. And I think that the frustration is not what the parties argue about whether we should have more government or less government, but really how government delivers. And when the COVID crisis first came up a year ago, public health officials were delayed about a month while they were waiting for approvals to start testing. This was in the Seattle area. At one point, one of the researchers had spent a week filling out all the paperwork to do the studies and sent it in, and it got bounced back because they said the rules required that it be submitted in hard copy, not in email. So you have this sense of a kind of a this is the pandemic that's coming to town, that something's wrong. But so there's clearly a problem of not letting the people on the ground honor the circumstances of time and place. If you have an emergency, you need to act immediately, not wait. But it's not as simple as just decentralized, because in the slowness of COVID vaccination wasn't suffered by, say, the UK, because they had a national database of who was old, and they could actually just, send people emails and make appointments centrally. That was fantastic. For some reason, we don't have that. I would have thought Medicare had it, but maybe it doesn't. And so, so we've had an incredibly spotty record in vaccine distribution, where the unlikely states like West Virginia have done well by decentralizing to lots of local pharmacies and somebody keeping track of it all. And other states have done absolutely terribly by decentralizing and not keeping track of it all. So, but I think the bottom line with COVID is that government delivery systems matter a lot. People can argue all they want about the goals of government. I think most people agree that we need to address climate change, need to provide healthcare for people, all that kind of stuff. But there's been really almost no attention to making government deliver the goods, whether it's overseeing safety or dealing with pandemics or controlling healthcare costs and the like. And so that's what hopefully we're going to talk about today.
Great. Well, and if I can turn to Elaine, Philip has mentioned the need for thinking about the systems. You have written recently in your Brookings paper about, among other things, the need for competence and experience as well by those who serve in government. Is that a lesson, or what are the other lessons that you would have us draw from our experience so far in handling the COVID crisis?
Well, first of all, thank you, Cary. And let me echo the wise words of Phillip Howard, as I have done for many years now. The thing that we leave out of our nomination system and our election system is any kind of evaluation of competence. And that is because we have moved to a system of nominating presidents that is wholly up to primary electorates. Whereas it used to be that it was up to the party leaders, the party bosses that everybody disliked. Well, one of the things they did, though, is that they had a sense of not only who could win, but who could govern. And so, for instance, way back in the 1920s, Henry Ford, very popular guy, big, a lot richer than Donald Trump, right? Big guy in the United States. Everybody knew his name. Wanted to run for president. And the Republican Party said, you're not qualified to be president. Making cars is not the same thing. So we've gotten ourselves in this fix now, where in 2016, we elected the least experienced candidate ever as president of the United States. And it's political parties that used to be the buffer and made sure that they served up at least two nominally competent people. In addition to that, though, I'd like to talk a little bit about the ongoing federal government, in addition to sort of the problems of presidential leadership. Every single time we have a crisis, okay, whether that crisis is an unanticipated terrorist attack, whether it's a Category 5 hurricane, or whether it's a pandemic, we discover that the government knows how to do an awful lot of things, but it can't do them together and in the right sequence, and they can't do it smoothly and quickly. because they run into, and of course, Philip is the master of the great government stories, but this business about having hard copies, I hadn't heard that, Philip, and that's just classic. So what I propose in this new paper is that the domestic side of the government start doing on a regular basis what the military has been doing for years. And there's basically three aspects to this, all right? One is to conduct scenarios on a regular basis, well-funded, with learning sessions, after action reviews, if you will, after those scenarios. The military calls them war games. They spend money to fight war games in outer space and stuff that we now can't really imagine, but that at least they are sort of ready. We do this in the domestic side of the government sporadically. We don't fund it very well. These things are expensive. And most importantly, nobody pays attention to what you learn. And what happens in a really well done war game is that you find out stuff that doesn't work. Okay, stuff that will kill you. You find out that there's, that they have to have hard copies. And afterwards you say, maybe we should get rid of that. So that's one. The second one is surge capacity. The military has, between the reserves and the National Guard, they have the capacity to augment the standing uniformed services for wartime, and they do that. So we don't keep an enormously large standing military, although it's plenty big, but there is a surge capacity. Here we found surge capacity happened kind of, sporadically and kind of episodically. I mean, New York nurses were great enough to go to other states and give their COVID experience when New York's cases went down and other cases went up. But we don't have an institutionalized surge capacity. And the third thing that is quite relevant, that they again, it's now happens accidentally. The military uses what's called dual use technology. They discovered back in the 90s that there was a lot of off-the-shelf civilian technology that could have military uses, that you didn't need a unique military use to produce that. Knowing that means that when you need stuff, whether the stuff is PPE or whatever it is, you can go into the private sector and you can get it. We don't do that enough with drugs and public health techniques, et cetera. Again, we've discovered it over this long, it's almost 1 year now. We've discovered how to do it, but we don't do that systematically. And so my paper is about using these three strategies as means for unearthing the kinds of things that Philip, for instance, unearths all the time in his research, okay? That where it is that the government can't get its act together. And then, of course, to learn from it. And if you don't have a competent leadership, none of that is going to happen.
Well, those are great suggestions for scenario planning and dual use technology and surge planning and management. All, as you say, that sort of draw lessons from the way the military operates. And Peter, maybe if I can turn to you, you have a recent paper that you published that I'd recommend to everybody on the panel in National Affairs, in which you point out how the public in the United States views the military as performing well and doing well, and they have a high level of confidence in the military, but not so much. In fact, you say very little confidence in the rest of government. And certainly when it comes to COVID and the COVID response, having confidence in your government and trust, for example, in the safety of vaccines turns out to be really critical to the pandemic response. What are your thoughts about how the government has handled the COVID pandemic and what we can learn from it, and maybe what we can learn about rebuilding public trust in government?
Well, I think in addition to the generalities that that most critics of government performance generate, you need to go under the hood. You really need to look under the hood, just as you would with a car or a machine, and see what's actually going on. And when you do that, you find that design may be very well planned, but it's not well executed. And why isn't it well executed? Well, it may be that you have the wrong people in place. It may be that the resources are insufficient or misaligned. It may be that the intersecting agencies that are needed to solve a problem don't communicate very well, and so forth. With COVID, I think we've seen all of that, although we really need I think a high-level commission to study exactly what went wrong. And this is complicated by the fact that what went wrong differed from state to state. In our decentralized system, we give a lot of responsibility to local and state governments, and their interaction with the federal government is problematic, as it has been especially true in this pandemic. So design can only take us so far. We have to look at the moving parts. And I think when we do that, we see that there are certain categories of dysfunction that we can identify and we can examine closely. One of them is incentives. The incentives that drive behavior that affects the success or failure of a program are often very poorly designed. Second is information. Often the information that is needed is in the wrong place, or it's outmoded, or it's addressing the wrong question, or it is not well distributed, because information is power. And it's one of the weapons that people use to advance their objectives. Another is management, simple mismanagement. We see that all the time at the federal level, and if we look more closely, we'd see it at state and local levels as well. So it's necessary, I think, to take both a broad structural approach in understanding what the major influences for government performance are, and then, as I say, get under the hood and look at how it actually operates. And I think with COVID, lots of things went wrong that we could easily identify, starting with the President of the United States, who completely misinformed and created a distrust of the healthcare professionals who could help. But it's much more than that, and we need to understand it.
Well, so incentives, information, and management. And I think when you mentioned, the response of the last president, his incentives when it came to the COVID were, it seemed that he wanted to deny it, look past it, hope that he could get reelected nevertheless. Phillip, we could turn back to you. What do you think would be some of the paths forward if there were a commission, for example, like Phillip mentioned, if Peter mentioned, and you and he actually wrote about in your US Today piece? What sorts of possible solutions might there be that you would put forward?
I think the fruit is so low hanging at this point that if you could make it past. If you could make it past a special interest, which is what a commission can do, because you can't kind of navigate Washington trade by trade, some of these systems. But I'd like to make I'd like to assert a hypothesis with two parts just to provoke people. The first is that legacy systems always take a life of their own. And so we have these legacy bureaucracies that are basically 50 years old. Most of the bureaucratic structures in this country got built up with starting around 1970, in the 60s, and they've accreted like sediment in the harbor since then. There was that wonderful moment when Elaine was in charge, when they actually came and dredged the harbor somewhat, but by and large, and Peter writes about this in Why Government Fails So Often, which I commend to everybody. You should buy 10 copies each. It really goes through what happens when you pass a law for good reasons and it has unintended consequences, and you never go back and fix it because there's some interest group that, has an interest in the unintended consequences, right? So the first is legacy bureaucracies are just crying out to be kind of cleaned out and made to work, not to deregulate, but to make them serve their goals. And the second point, and this goes to both Elaine's and Peter's point, is we do need better leadership, but we need a framework that honors leadership at every level of society. And so one of the philosophical flaws, I believe, that came out of the remaking of government, starting in the 1960s, is it tried to dictate a correct way of doing things. It tried to push decisions down to the ground so that people have to comply with everything and then it's done correctly. It's been a lot of work since then showing the systems actually work a lot better in most cases, if they don't go all the way to the ground. If they have goals, they have principles, they have accountability mechanisms, but you let people like the public health workers in Seattle bob and weave and adapt to meet the goals in front of them. So one of the things a special commission could do is not only account for obsolete laws and and obsolete bureaucracies and make an effort at making them work better, but also could re-empower human agency on the ground so that people at least have the chance of leading. They can wake up in the morning, roll up their sleeves, and actually solve the public, whatever the public problems are.
Well, two areas that are really at that ground level are education and policing. I mean, education has its history of challenges, but it's also tied in at the present day with the COVID crisis too, and reopening schools and making them safe. Policing has also been an area of acute challenge to society, and as we've seen so palpably over the last year with the racial injustices that are inflicted by the hands of some police officers and have transformed the nation rightly to expose and make evident the progress that we still need to make in terms of racial equality and justice. How does this all play out in terms of what are some solutions at the state and local level that might address the challenges facing either public education or public policing?
Well, I have some general observations on this score, general in the sense that they apply pretty much across the board to all the state and local arrangements that we have. One has to do with the disciplinary mechanisms for assuring that people do their jobs within the ambit of the law. And unfortunately, those systems are often very rigid, and they are controlled by unions and other organizations that really don't want to see discipline imposed. They have their own interests involved. They also have their own perspectives, so they see many disciplinary proceedings as unfair, and partly because they don't take into account the sort of situation sense of the cop on the beat or the teacher in the classroom. So that's one set of things that we really need to look at. Another is pension reform, which is also very much influenced by unions. And in the long run, I think people who study municipal finance and state finance predict that these are going to actually cripple the future of government in ways that we're really not talking about, because it's very unpleasant and a lot of hard choices have to be made. So there are power structures. The point is that there are power structures at the state and local level that really need to be confronted, and that requires a lot of mobilization of public opinion and some very hard choices.
But just
Elaine?
on one point,
No, go
just
ahead.
one point that Peter made, the distrust that we see now of the public sector is so exacerbated in the last year by these incidents of the George Floyd killing, where the cop had, like 24 complaints against him, and they couldn't do anything about him. And the Minneapolis police force, out of 2,700 complaints over the last 8 years, there were 12 disciplinary measures and no one dismissed. I mean, the police chiefs have no authority because of the teachers union. I mean, because of the police unions. And then the teachers haven't gone back to work despite pleading by the Chicago mayor, by the Center for Disease Control, by everybody, by the experience in Europe where they've opened schools and they haven't been super spreaders, experience already. But the teachers union is only interested in itself. It's not interested in the kids. So we've got grocery clerks, nurses, EMTs, doctors, all these people working full time in the middle of COVID, and the teachers refusing to teach our kids. I mean, it's really just a startling breakdown in both responsibility and accountability, and laid, not to put too fine a point on it, at the feet in both cases of the public unions.
I want to let Elaine jump in here.
Yeah, I just want to, I just want to make a point about state and local in general, apart from the teachers and the policemen. What we're seeing now with COVID vaccines is a classic last mile problem. It's a problem in technology. It's a problem in delivery of the problem at the United States Postal Service. And in our system, whenever something big needs to happen, whenever there needs to be a response, a nationwide response, we have to rely on state and local governments, as we have to rely on them now to actually deliver the vaccines. There simply aren't, it's a huge federal workforce, but it is not big enough to deliver vaccines to, 200 to 300 million Americans. So the government, the interesting thing about the federal government is that it has to be concerned with the capacity of the state and local governments. And this is something that the Trump administration and the Republicans in the Senate just couldn't get through their heads, that basically it's not just COVID, it's almost everything we do federally on the domestic side is actually implemented at the state and local level. So when you let state and local government degrade in some way, you can't achieve anything nationally. And this was a huge disconnect towards the end of the Trump administration, where the Republicans kept refusing to give money to state and local governments. And people were saying, well, who do you think is going to actually deliver these vaccines into people's arms?
I'd like to make 2 points along those lines. One is just a statistical fact that the size of the federal workforce has not increased since 1960. 60 years, it's basically stable. That doesn't mean that the federal government doesn't spend a lot more money than it did in 1960, but it does so through outsourcing and by giving money to state and local governments. So that's one very important point. And another thing is that the state and local responsibilities are vast. They are responsible for the things that matter to voters most, I would say, especially education and local government activities. The revenue sharing is, I think, an issue that ought to be looked at again. Although it was associated with the Republican administration through Nixon and Reagan, I think we probably need a lot more revenue sharing, because the federal government has gobbled up most of the revenue that's taxable, and it's going to use it. It doesn't want to give it back to the states. Politicians have gone to the trouble of imposing taxes, and they want to hold on to it. But I think that really is underfunding the state and local governments that, as Elaine is saying, do most of the work and most of the important work of public service.
I want to remind the audience members that you can ask questions via the Q&A function. And in fact, I'm going to turn to some of those now. Shep Melnick has joined us, and I'm delighted to ask a couple of questions prompted by his intervention. First, he acknowledges how much over the years each of our panel members have provided useful diagnoses of the problems affecting government and offering various recommendations for how to do better. And one question that comes up from this, can you share with us those instances where you think your analysis or recommendations have actually produced some beneficial change? Or in other words, what are maybe the success stories of improvements that have been made to government over the last several decades?
Well, I'll start with that if I can.
Sure.
And building off Peter's point, the federal government, the size of the federal government has in fact remained fairly stable since the 1960s, although to listen to some Republicans, you wouldn't know it. I think that there is a need for actually more expertise in the government and some growth. But one of the reasons is that the federal government successfully, along with state governments, led the transition to online transactions. So we now take for granted something that was almost never done back in the 1990s, which is we take for granted that we can register our car online, that we can renew our driver's licenses online. There's an awful lot of transactions. Almost everybody files their taxes online. That was not the case back in the 1990s. So the government has, in fact, kept up with the times and, in fact, gone right into the digital age, and that has saved lots of, it's kept the size of the government low because you don't need that many people, and so I think that's been an actual achievement that both the federal government and the states have done. I also think that there's an unknown story on the federal government, which is the flexibilities in procurement and in civil service that have been initiated over time, in part as a result of reinventing government, part of result of Phillip Howard's one classic examples after another, and Peter writing books about this. And these things have happened. What has not happened, which I want to talk about a little bit, is we have not gotten to the point where, even though we have flexibilities in hiring, et cetera, we have not gotten to the point where we can get the pay scales in the federal government up to where they're supposed to be, because that is a wildly unpopular thing to do, as you can well imagine. Right now, there is a Deloitte contract, a big contract that the feds let to build the database to get people vaccinated. Total disaster. States have junked it. They're building their own, et cetera. It is but one in a long line of federal government contracts to IT companies that bombed. And we're not talking about hundreds, we're talking about billions of dollars of just wasted money. Now, the United States government needs to hire the same kind of people that Microsoft hires and Google hires. Can we hire them when the salaries are capped at when the highest salary in the land, $400,000, is the president of the United States, and everybody has to make less than them? No, we can't get them. Okay, we just can't get these people. We can't get the people who are building the future of the internet. So this is where we're sort of stuck. We don't really need a bigger government, but we need an awful lot smarter government to keep up and keep us from wasting more and more money. We cannot hire that government. The bottom line is we cannot hire that government because, let's face it, if you're making $50,000 a year, or you're $75,000 a year, which is the average family of four, paying somebody $500,000 to work for the government and oversee IT programs sounds awful and ridiculous, right? Sounds terrible. And yet, those people, I was about to say those guys, because so many of them are guys, but increasingly there's some women. Those people make oodles of money in the private sector. And whether it's IT, whether it's drugs and pharma, we have had a really hard time breaking through in that pay scale. Now, this is probably the most unpopular thing I've said today, along with the fact that we should not nominate people through primaries, but I'll just put it out there.
Get the government you pay for, in other words. Philip?
Yeah. I think there are lots of examples of things that improved in states. And, we've had a lot of good governors in the period that, in this 50-year period that I'm talking about. Mitch Daniels cleaned out lots of obsolete commissions, and in Indiana, the state of Texas put in sunset commissions that actually have teeth that go in and look at whether things are really needed or not. Zell Miller, when he was governor of Georgia, overhauled the civil service system amazingly. And the surveys afterwards showed that public employee satisfaction went up dramatically after they actually restored accountability, if you can imagine that. Reinventing government instituted a lot of flexibility in procurement with Elaine and Steve.
Don't forget Gina Raimondo in Rhode Island.
Yeah, Gina Raimondo, fantastic. And some of these people, I've worked at one point with Tom Vilsack when he was governor of Iowa, are in the new administration. So there have been a lot of examples of things, but what there hasn't been, going to Elaine's point, and Peter and I have talked about this, there hasn't been a concerted look at the need to reboot things to make them work better. To overhaul the civil service system so it doesn't assume everybody's a clerk in a field of desks processing things, that pays people well, but not just pays them well, but also gives them responsibility, the authority that goes along so they can actually do their job, so they can be leaders. And that inspires people as much or more than money. So there are all these things that need to get remade, but we treat these institutions of government like they were mountain ranges, these dense bureaucracies, when they're just human creations, again, largely the last 50 years. And it's just time to, if you were running a company, you would say, gosh, this is the easiest thing in the world. How do we attract good people to government? You could talk to Elaine and a few other people, and you'd come up with a different system. How do we make it so that healthcare doesn't spend 30% of the money on administration? That's $1 million per doctor. Well, you would go in and say, well, why are we diverting so much time to filling out paperwork and fee-for-service billing and stuff? You would come up with a proposal. And that's the narrative I think we need now, which is not do we need government, do we not need government, but how do we make it work?
Peter, if I could just also ask a second part of Schuck's question that he was raising too, is like, when can this kind of analysis be helpful? Or in addition to thinking about the successes and the failures, which you have done so well in your recent book, what's the sort of the conditions under which government is receptive to making positive changes?
Okay, well, I think that may come out in the course of my discussion, some of the successes. There have been a number of signal successes in federal policy, but each of them comes with a story. And sometimes the story is that it needs to be revisited because the original impetus for it and the original rationale for it has changed over time. So one example would be something that Elaine knows a lot about, is the Civil Service Reform Act of 1978, which created a senior executive service. That was a big change that had many good qualities to it, but it was not revisited frequently enough, and it's no longer doing the job that we hoped it would. Another example is the Voting Rights Act of 1965, one of the greatest reforms in American history. But as we know, the Supreme Court not so long ago basically emasculated the Voting Rights Act. But until it did that, and even today, to some extent, it's actually transformed American politics and participation. Another example would be the immigration law of 1965, which utterly transformed our society and will continue to for years to come. But the recent administration perverted the immigration law in ways that are now going to have to be rectified, and I think will be rectified by Biden. Another is the earned income tax credit, which was adopted in the early 1970s and is a much better way of increasing the income of low-income workers than raising the minimum wage. It has a much less negative effect on employment, and it's been very, very successful. And then I guess at the top of the heap would be NIH, which is one of the greatest creations of government in the world. Now, that's an example of one in which the government basically puts up the money and endows very, very talented people and teams of people to work together. So it's not that the government is calling the shots, but nevertheless, it has created a set of actors that have transformed the world.
Elaine?
Yeah, let me add one more example that I'm sorry I didn't think about this earlier. The example that comes to me is, of course, passage of Goldwater Nichols in 1986. This was a piece of legislation that took literally 40 years to pass, because starting in the Second World War, the analysis of the American military was that the right hand didn't know what the left hand was doing, and that the inter-service rivalries were really disastrous when we were in battle. Finally, Barry Goldwater and Sam Nunn got together and really a sort of remarkable story, managed to pass this and get the Reagan administration to sign it, even though the defense secretary was against it. And all you need to know about it is the difference between the 1980 failure that Jimmy Carter experienced in trying to rescue the hostages in Tehran and the success in I forget what year it was, 2013 maybe, maybe 2015, that anyway, Obama managing to capture and assassinate Osama bin Laden. Okay, those two stories are literally the story of jointness, and it's an organizational. It was an organizational, transformation of the U.S. military. And I've had students over the years in my classes at the Kennedy School. Some, senior officers there doing their, training to get the next promotion, and then some new young men right out of the military academies, and the difference is night and day, and they've talked about it. The difference in the military is absolutely night and day. They reserve their inter-service rivalry for the football games, and that's it. And other than that, the new generation has a very different attitude towards how they see their role vis-a-vis the other branches of the military. And I think that's a big one. I think that's a really big one.
Cary, if I could add just one more example, because it's so relevant today. I mentioned the Immigration Act of 1965, but the amnesty of 1986, which desperately needs a renewal now, was a big success in helping to reduce the problem of undocumented, the status or non-status undocumented immigrants, but it needs to be updated and extended and renovated. But that was a very important piece of legislation.
Philip? Maybe I can turn to you, Philip, because another question that came in is whether you have any special recommendations about efforts to reduce unnecessary regulations. So how do we get to the point of getting rid of some of the regulations when they're not needed?
Well, first of all, I really think the model of base closing commissions, the special interest minefield in Washington is such that there's an interest group for every single rule, and so you just can't go in and navigate this minefield and come up with anything that looks sensible at all. You really need, just like closing defense spaces, independent commissions to make proposals where people can see what the costs and benefits are overall, rather than kind of piece by piece negotiation. And again, there are two categories. There are a lot of laws out there that just don't work as they're intended. Again, Peter's really cataloged these things. And secondly, if you go in to schools, and we're starting to do this now at Common Good, and hospitals, and you do an X-ray of the human of the opportunity cost of bureaucracy to teachers and principals and doctors and nurses, how much time they spend complying rather than doing what they're supposed to do, which is caring for patients or looking after students. You see this incredible, it's just extraordinary, ruinous inefficiency and cost, and it causes people to burn out because they can't keep track of it all. We really have to have a commission go in and say, what are the conditions under which successful schools operate? And let's go and have the federal government take the lead, as Elaine was saying, to convince states to clean out their own bureaucracy. A lot of this stuff is not federal, it's state-based.
Yeah.
And if we had a kind of a general spring cleaning aimed at making everything work better, not deregulating, I mean, it would be so popular. I mean, Biden would go down in history as the most popular president since George Washington if he did that. People are frustrated to death.
I've got a couple of other questions that build on that. One, Dan Walters from Penn State Law asks this question about if we actually free up the constraints that are placed upon the civil service, and I think he's thinking mostly in the federal level, isn't it? Yes, we'll have greater accountability and greater responsibility by those who are delivering services and when working at the ground level. But he asks, isn't the Trump administration just a giant monument to the problems with the flattening of the bureaucracy? Do we then lose the capacity to have civil servants be protected from politicization emanating from up at the top? I'm sorry to talk again. I've actually studied and written a lot about this, including I'm probably the guy to blame for that horrible Schedule F that Trump did, because I did a paper on the unconstitutionality of collective bargaining under Article 2. The Lloyd La-Follette Act in 1912 for civil service said that civil servants could be accountable, but they couldn't be fired for political reasons. And they had an independent agency that had the authority to veto firings that they thought might be for political reasons. You can put in checks and balances, which I support, to prevent some jerk like Donald Trump from firing people because they believe in climate change or whatever, whatever he believed in. And I'm all for that. But that's different than having 1,000-page rule books, a complete absence of accountability. 99% of federal employees get fully successful ratings. The inability to manage a public office by SESers under a lot of union contracts. So it needs to be, is what Elaine was saying, you need to modernize it for a good, competent workforce. And that includes protections against unfairness. It has
preserving the current system is nothing but, in my view, a monument to unfairness.
One of our students asks, maybe to move this forward here, how much of what you've been talking about can the new Biden administration accomplish on its own, or how much of it would it need Congress to step in and give it authority to reform these structures? And I'm struck in a way, Elaine and Phillip and Peter, you've talked a lot about the successful reforms being ones that involve new legislation.
Yeah.
Is that a lesson to be drawn from all of this?
Well, in the case of Biden, just eliminating some of the extraordinarily perverse and even corrupt regulatory changes introduced by Trump is absolutely essential, but it's not going to be permanent unless it's institutionalized in legislation. We see that right now, and we see it in connection with Trump, who basically reversed almost all of Obama's major policy initiatives. So it's just a fact of life. Unless it's embedded in legislation, it's subject to reversal. Mm-hmm. So there's that. I think it's also the case that the new policies take a long time to develop, both in terms of the figuring out what ought to be done and gathering the necessary data, but also in selling to the relevant interest groups. And one thing that has to be done, and this is a sort of a footnote to my mention of some of the policy successes of the past, is that those who are going to lose from reforms, those are going to be worse off from reforms, at least in the short run, basically have to be paid off. And we did that in connection with the deregulation of airlines, for example, in which communities that would no longer get service under a deregulated system were given subsidies for a while. And and it's also true with trade, free trade. We need to help workers get retraining. So that's an important part of any policy change that is going to make some people worse off, even as it makes most people much better off.
And this may be getting a bit into the weeds. I don't know if anybody wants to respond to this question, but the questioner says, speaking of 1,000-page rule books, what should OMB do to reform the CFO Act and performance management now in Circular A11? Anybody want to respond to that? or personnel management at all, which could be something that OMB could presumably do some things on its own. Anybody want to respond on personnel management at all?
Well, I can say that one of the things that's happened, there's two levels of personnel management, right? There's obviously the political level, which, I think Biden will get competent people, but he will get people who are Democrats who supported him, and there's no reason we should change that. I think that at the civil service level, one of the things that has happened, and partially because we failed in reinventing government to get civil service reform. I mean, we could never get a bill through Congress on civil service reform. And I will predict that you never will get a bill through Congress on civil service reform for one simple reason. No one is in the middle on this one. No one is in the center. The only people interested in civil service reform in Congress are people who want to kill the unions or people who would like to buttress the strength of the unions. There is no in between. I didn't see it 20 some years ago. I still don't see it. What has happened, however, and this is surprising to a lot of people, is about 50% of the federal workforce is out from under Title IX right now. Title V right now. In other words, they're not in the civil service system. They've got their own systems. And one by one, and we used to call this the samizdat process after the old systems in the former Soviet Union, which nobody remembers anymore, in the old Soviet Union, where they would have these secret papers on how to actually get around the rules to actually get things done. And these were kind of, underground papers. And, we used to circulate these little statutes that would get tucked in appropriations bills, nobody would notice, et cetera. And, I still say to this, whenever I talk to civil servants, I said, just go to your appropriators. Don't make a big deal about this. Okay. If you try to do it at the national level, oh my God, all these people are going to come out of the woodwork and it's going to be a mess. But surprisingly enough, NIH is a good example where they got out of the civil service system. That was not a system that was built to hire molecular biologists. It's a system, as Phillip said, it's a system that was designed around clerks, pre-computer age. And they got out of it. And a lot of the defense and national security agencies have gotten out of it too. So I think that the way you run personnel in the federal government these days is to encourage, and the White House could do this, encourage agencies to think about what they need to do their mission, and then ask Congress for permission to do it. And I would forget, at least for the time being, I'd forget any great big civil service reform bill, because I think, frankly, it's doomed to failure. And in the end, I'm not sure that's the way to go anyway, because what you really want is you want each agency to have a system that protects its workers from political interference, but that is geared towards the needs of that agency.
Well, we're coming to the close here, and I wanted to ask and go around to each panel member and ask if you can offer some reflections for those in the audience who are still at the earlier stages of their careers, maybe some of our students, and look forward and offer some advice to them about the pathways that they might take toward making government better in the future. And I am asking that closing question with apologies, of course, to all of the others on the Q&A. We've got a number of other questions we were unable to get to today, but let's close with something forward-looking and advice that you would offer for those in the future who may be in leadership positions and could make decisions about making some of these systems and incentives that you've talked about work in a more functional fashion. And I'm open to whatever order you want to go in. Should we go again? Let's go in reverse order now. Maybe turn to Peter first, and then we'll end with Phillip.
Okay, well, I don't know that this is inspiring. It's actually sort of nuts and bolts. But one thing is that they ought to study economics. Because that is a very powerful way of analyzing policy problems. And it doesn't provide all that one needs to know in order to be wise in policy making, but it's a very, very important set of skills. Why don't I stop there since we're running out of time?
Great. Elaine?
I would say get into the belly of the beast. I mean, go work in government. You're not going to be able to fix it if you don't know anything about it. Resist the siren calls of Accenture and all the big consulting firms who will have you looking at it from the outside and writing papers. They may pay you a little bit more, but I'd say get into government, because you cannot fix this unless you are inside of it and you understand something about how it works inside.
Yeah, and I would say look at government and actually most things with a beginner's mind. Don't assume things are the way they are because they should be. And so ask yourself, should it work this way? Would it work better another way? And, I think we're, Peter's point about economics, I studied microeconomics, and my first jobs were in government, working in microeconomics at Oak Ridge. And I think looking at how things work and how they could work better is really essential, because government is so important in an interdependent world. It's twice as important now as it was when I got out of school. We don't know who made our food. We don't know if the water is pure. We don't know if the toys have lead paint. Government does all these things. We need it to work. We need it to work. And there's been insufficient attention on adapting it to work as well as it could.
So better academic preparation, more experience, and an open mind and a vision for improving the future. All excellent words of wisdom. Thank you. Oh, Peter, one last comment.
An emphasis on implementation. People do not study implementation much in political science anymore, or in policy, in public policy schools. But it's absolutely crucial, and you can, I think, envision many of the obstacles that need to be overcome by studying the past difficulties that have been encountered when good ideas have to be implemented in the real world.
Well, you, the three of you, I want to thank enormously for taking the time to be with us today and sharing your expertise on implementation and on the vision for a better government in the future, and for all that you have done to advance both those ideas for a better government and to implement them. With that, we're going to conclude. We are out of time. If we had a chance to be all together, I'm sure you'd have a rousing, an audible round of applause. But we are metaphorically sending that your way. I want to again thank all of our audience members for joining us today and remind you that today's session has been recorded and will later be uploaded to the Penn Program on Regulation YouTube channel. Thank you very much and have a good rest of the day.